Fred Williams had not touched a drop of alcohol in 11 years, 3 months, and 14 days. He knew the exact number because he kept a little leather journal, the same one his late mother had pressed into his hands the morning he walked out of his last rehabilitation program and into a world he was determined to finally get right. Every morning, before his feet hit the floor, Fred opened that journal and wrote the date. Not a long entry, just the date and 2 words beneath it. Still standing. 11 years. Hundreds of early mornings scribbling in that journal. Thousands of days choosing water over whiskey, choosing the long way home over the fast route past the liquor store on Malcolm Street. He had rebuilt everything. His sobriety, his business, his relationship with his daughter Camille, and his sense of self-worth that had once been so eroded it barely existed. He had crawled back from a place most men never return from, and he had done it one day at a time, with nothing but willpower and the memory of his mother's face watching him through a hospital room window. On the night of October 14th, Fred Williams was driving home from a church fundraiser. He had just spent 4 hours helping organize a dinner for the Widows and Orphans Fund at Greater Hope Baptist Church, hauling folding tables, arranging centerpieces, serving plates of chicken and collard greens to elderly women who called him baby and pinched his cheeks. He was tired in the best possible way. Tired the way you get when your body has been useful and your soul has been fed. The kind of tired that makes you feel grateful for the bed waiting at the other end of the drive. His truck, a well-kept 2019 Ford F-150, charcoal gray, freshly washed, moved through the quiet residential streets of Delmont, a small Georgia city about 40 minutes south of Atlanta. The night was cool. The radio was on low, a gospel station playing a hymn Fred's mother used to hum. He was thinking about calling Camille when he got home. She'd just been accepted to Georgia State's nursing program. He wanted to hear her voice. He never made it home without getting stopped. The lights hit his rearview mirror at 9:47 p.m. Red and blue, slicing through the dark like a verdict. Fred felt the familiar tightening in his chest that every black man in America knows intimately. Not guilt. Not the panic of a person who has done something wrong, something older and more primal than that. The specific anxiety of being seen by the law when the law has not always seen you fairly. He pulled over smoothly, put it in park, cut the radio, rolled down the window, put both hands on the steering wheel, visible where they could be seen. Officer Ronald Carol stepped out of his cruiser, and what happened in the next 47 minutes would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted, and would eventually force an entire police department, a county DA's office, and a community of 30,000 people to confront a truth they had been carefully avoiding for years. Before we get started, if you've ever been pulled over and felt like something wasn't right, or if you care about what's really happening on America's roads tonight, smash that like button and subscribe right now. What Fred Williams went through will make your blood run hot, and the truth that came out afterward, nobody in that police department wanted you to hear it. This is the full story. Ronald Carol had been a cop for 9 years. He was 34 years old, heavy-set, with a thick red-blonde beard that had earned him the nickname Viking among his colleagues at the Delmont Police Department. He had been named Officer of the Month 6 times. He drove patrol cars like he owned the road. He knew every pothole on Route 9, every speed trap near Holloway Elementary, every shortcut between the old textile mill and the interstate. He had made over 400 arrests in his career. He had written over 2,000 traffic citations. He had also, in that same 9 years, never once been formally disciplined. Not for the excessive force complaint filed by Marcus Telfair in 2019, which was reviewed internally and dismissed as unsubstantiated. Not for the 2 civil suits that had been quietly settled by the city without admission of wrongdoing. Not for the departmental whispers that followed him like weather. Ronald Carol existed within a system that had, at every turn, chosen to protect rather than examine him. And in return, he had given that system exactly what it seemed to want. Numbers, arrests, citations, clearance rates, the kind of productivity that looked good in budget meetings and city council presentations. On the night of October 14th, Ronald Carol was on his 4th patrol hour of a 12-hour shift. He had already written 3 speeding tickets and responded to a noise complaint. He was not in a particularly notable mood, neither agitated nor relaxed, just present in the particular hollow way of someone going through well-practiced motions. He spotted Fred's truck on Calder Street near the intersection with Vine. The truck was moving at precisely 28 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. There was nothing wrong with the truck. No broken taillight, no expired registration sticker, no erratic movement, no lane weaving, no rolling stop at the intersection ahead, where Fred stopped completely, waited the appropriate 2 seconds, and then proceeded. Ronald Carol turned on his lights and pulled him over anyway. In the incident report he later filed, and Carol wrote that he initiated the stop because the vehicle was traveling at a reduced speed, consistent with an impaired driver attempting to avoid detection. 28 in a 30. That was his justification. Fred saw the lights and felt his hands go tight on the wheel. He did everything right. He pulled over within 30 feet of the nearest curb. He did not fumble or jerk or make any sudden movements. He kept both hands at 10 and 2, visible through the windshield. He reached slowly into the center console for his registration, and then into his wallet, which was in plain sight on the passenger seat, for his license. He had both documents ready before Ronald Carol reached the driver's side door. Carol approached with his flashlight already on, sweeping it across the cab before he reached the window. "Evening," Fred said. Well, Carol did not return the greeting. He shone the flashlight directly into Fred's face for a long moment, longer than necessary, longer than comfortable, the kind of light in the face that is sometimes a test and sometimes just a power display. Fred kept his expression neutral. He had learned that skill over years that included courtrooms and intake processing rooms and parole hearings, the art of keeping your face from saying what your body was feeling. "License and registration," Carol said. Fred extended both through the window, already organized. Carol took them without acknowledgement and studied the license under the flashlight beam. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Fred blinked. "May I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle." No explanation. No stated reason. Just the command. And I repeated with the particular flatness of a man who was used to being obeyed. Fred stepped out. He was wearing slacks and a collared button-down, the same clothes he'd worn to the church fundraiser. His shoes were clean. His eyes were clear. He stood beside his truck with his hands slightly out from his sides in that quiet, unbidden gesture of non-threat that black men in America perform instinctively in moments like this. Carol walked a slow circle around him, saying nothing. And then he leaned in, close, deliberate, performative, and inhaled. When he pulled back, his expression had shifted into something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I smell alcohol on your breath," Ronald Carol said. Fred Williams looked at him. 11 years, 3 months, 14 days. "No, sir," Fred said quietly. "That isn't possible." "Are you disputing what I'm telling you?" "I'm telling you I don't drink. Haven't in 11 years. I was just at a church fundraiser. Greater Hope Baptist on Clemens Road. I've been there since 5 o'clock. "Have you had anything to drink this evening?" "No, sir." "Water. And coffee at the church. That's all." Carol wrote something in his notepad. "I'm going to ask you to perform a series of field sobriety tests," he said. Not asked. Told. And here is where things began to move in a direction that would matter deeply months later, in a courtroom where a judge was going to ask very careful questions about everything that happened on Calder Street that night. Fred Williams, unlike most people who are pulled over under similar circumstances, knew something. He was not a lawyer. He was not a legal scholar. He was a 51-year-old small business owner who ran a heating and air conditioning repair service with 6 employees and a client list that stretched across 2 counties. But 4 years earlier, his nephew Deshaun had been arrested on a DUI charge that Fred had watched unfold from the waiting room of a Fulton County courthouse, and the attorney who had represented Deshaun, a methodical, meticulous woman named Patricia Okafor, had spent an entire Saturday afternoon at the family kitchen table explaining, in plain language, what people's rights actually were during a traffic stop. She had done it because she was tired of seeing the same mistakes cost the same kinds of people the same enormous prices. Fred had listened to every word Patricia Okafor said that afternoon. He had written some of it down. He thought about her now. "Officer," Fred said, his voice measured and clear, "I want to respect your authority, and I want this interaction to be calm. But I need to understand. Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" Carol stared at him. "I'm conducting a DWI investigation. You are being detained." "Okay," Fred said. "Then I want to respectfully inform you that I'm exercising my constitutional right not to answer questions about what I may or may not have eaten or consumed this evening. And I'd like to speak with an attorney before performing any voluntary field sobriety tests." The quiet that followed that sentence had a texture to it. Ronald Carol's jaw moved slightly. His flashlight didn't move. The Georgia night pressed in around them. Crickets, distant traffic, the warm smell of pine from the trees at the edge of the road. "You got something to hide," Carol said. "No, sir. I have rights. That's different." Carol stepped closer. "The smell of alcohol on your breath is enough for me to take this investigation further. I need you to walk a straight line. With respect, officer, field sobriety tests are voluntary in the state of Georgia. I'm choosing not to participate without my attorney present. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just asking for my rights." Something changed in Carol's face. Not obviously. He was too experienced for that. But something behind his eyes went to a different, darker place. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he said. "Am I under arrest?" "Turn around." "What am I being charged with?" "Driving under the influence." "Turn around now." Fred Williams turned around. He put his hands behind his back. He did not resist, did not struggle, did not raise his voice. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he said one more thing, quietly, to the Georgian night air. "My phone is on the passenger seat. I need someone to call my daughter." Ronald Carol did not respond to that. He put Fred Williams in the back of his cruiser, called for a tow truck to impound the F-150, and drove to the Delmont County Correctional Processing Center. At no point during the arrest did he administer a breathalyzer test. At no point did he conduct a properly observed field sobriety evaluation. He had a smell. He had a suspicion. He had a piece of paper and a pen. And he had 9 years of a system telling him that was enough. The Delmont County Processing Center was a beige building that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that seemed designed to make everyone look slightly unwell. Fred Williams sat in a plastic chair with his wrists still cuffed. They hadn't removed them when he sat down, and stared at the wall directly ahead of him. He was thinking clearly. That was the thing people who have been through the particular crucible of addiction recovery often develop, an ability to stay present and functional in the middle of circumstances that would scatter other people. Fred had sat in rooms worse than this one. He had stared at walls that had no exit. He had found his way through before, and he would find his way through now. But beneath the discipline and the calm was something that felt like a cold, slow anger, Not the kind that makes you do stupid things, but the kind that accumulates, that files things away, that waits. At 10:23 p.m., a processing officer named Deputy Kwan administered a breathalyzer test. The machine beeped. 0.00. Deputy Kwan looked at the machine. He looked at Fred. He looked back at the machine and administered the test again, because a reading of 0 was not especially common during a DWI intake. 0.00. Huh, Deputy Kwan said, almost to himself. He wrote the result down. He administered the test a third time, standard protocol for a 0 reading. 0.00. Fred Williams looked at Deputy Kwan with eyes that said everything and nothing. "I told him," Fred said softly. "I told the officer when he stopped me. I don't drink. I'm 11 years sober." Deputy Kwan said nothing. He wrote things down. He was not the officer who had made the arrest. He was the officer who processed the paperwork, and those were different jobs with different amounts of discretion and different amounts of culpability. He was not, in this moment, going to become anything other than what he was paid to be. Fred was placed in a holding cell. At 11:06 p.m., Fred's daughter Camille arrived at the processing center. Camille Williams was 26 years old and looked, Fred had always thought, exactly like her mother. Same high cheekbones, same dark, serious eyes, same way of walking into a room like she intended to learn everything about it. And she had gotten the call from a church friend named Brother Amos, who had seen Fred's truck getting towed from Calder Street and had eventually tracked down what had happened. Camille had called 4 people in rapid succession, left 2 voicemails, and driven 40 minutes in under 35, which Fred chose not to think about. She was furious in the contained, professional way she had inherited from him. At the front desk, she asked to see her father. She was told he was being processed, and she would have to wait. She sat down in a plastic chair that matched the plastic chairs in the room where Fred was being held, though neither of them knew the other was sitting in the same brand of furniture 12 feet and a cinder block wall apart. She called a lawyer at 11:14 p.m. The lawyer's name was Marcus Webb, that he was 43 years old, based in Atlanta, and had a particular specialty in civil rights litigation and police misconduct cases. He was also, not incidentally, Patricia Okafor's husband and legal partner. Camille had gotten his number from Deshaun, who had kept it in his phone for 4 years, the same way you keep a fire extinguisher. You hope you never need it, but you make sure you know where it is. Marcus Webb answered on the 3rd ring. He listened to what Camille told him. He asked 4 questions. He told her not to let her father sign anything, agree to anything, or answer any further questions until he arrived. He said he was leaving Atlanta immediately. He arrived at the Delmont Processing Center at 12:51 a.m. In the meantime, Fred Williams had been visited by a second officer, not Ronald Carol, who had finished his initial paperwork and returned to patrol, but a sergeant named Paul Dreyer, who oversaw a DWI case intake. Dreyer was 51 years old, a cautious, experienced man who had watched enough cases go sideways to develop a reflexive wariness about anything that didn't fit neatly into the standard playbook. The breathalyzer results had been brought to Dreyer's attention by Deputy Kwan. Dreyer had looked at the 3 0.00 readings, and then at the arrest report, and then at Carol's written statement, which contained the phrase, "strong odor of alcoholic beverage emanating from suspect's breath and person." He had sat with that for a moment. Then he had gone to the holding area to look at Fred Williams through the observation window. Fred was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, spine straight, eyes calm. He was not agitated, not disheveled, not showing any of the physical indicators of intoxication or even recent alcohol consumption. His eyes were clear and tracking normally. His motor coordination, as far as Dreyer could observe, was completely unremarkable. Dreyer went back to his desk and sat down, and thought about things for a while. He did not release Fred. He did not call Carol. He wrote a note to himself in his legal pad that said only, breathalyzer, 3 readings, 0. Review. That note, small and almost illegible, written in blue ballpoint by a cautious sergeant at 1 a.m, would become, much later, in a context Dreher never anticipated, one of the most significant documents in the entire case. Marcus Webb was the kind of lawyer who wore expensive shoes and drove a modest car, and he had learned early in his career that it was better for clients to trust you than to be impressed by you, and that the best way to earn trust was to always be exactly as competent as you presented yourself to be, without the performance and without the theater. He arrived at the processing center at 12:51 a.m. in a dark blue Ford Fusion with 180,000 miles on the odometer. His shoes, by contrast, were Italian leather, chosen because he believed you should be able to look down at your feet during long days in courtrooms and feel something worth feeling. He was allowed to meet with Fred at 1:04 a.m. in a small consultation room that smelled like dry erase markers and institutional anxiety. Fred told Marcus everything, in the exact order it had happened, without editorializing or omitting anything, and because he had nothing to hide, and had learned long ago that the truth told plainly and completely was the only foundation worth building on. Marcus Webb listened with the particular quality of attention that separates exceptional lawyers from merely good ones, completely still, completely focused, occasionally writing a single word in his yellow legal pad. When Fred finished, Marcus sat quietly for a moment. "You asked whether you were being detained or free to go," Marcus said. "Yes." "And you declined the field sobriety tests." "Yes. I told him they were voluntary, and I wanted my attorney present." "And you asked for a lawyer before he arrested you?" "Before." "Yes." Marcus wrote another word in his pad. "Tell me about the smell," Marcus said. What could he have smelled? Fred thought. The church had dinner. Chicken, sides, a few desserts. There might have been wine for the communion service earlier in the week. I don't attend communion because of my sobriety, but the chalices were in the same room where we set up. The tablecloths might have had something on them. I was moving tables all evening. Grape juice or wine from tablecloths, Marcus said, writing. Also, and I don't know if this matters, I had kombucha with my lunch, about noon. It has a slight fermented smell. Marcus looked up from his pad. Kombucha, he said, with a particular quality of stillness. Is that important? It could be very important, Marcus said. Kombucha ferments. It contains a trace amount of natural alcohol, typically less than 0.5%. But more relevantly for our purposes, it can produce an odor that is consistent with what people describe when they smell alcohol. Police officers are trained to detect the odor of alcoholic beverages, but the training doesn't always distinguish between ethanol from beer or spirits and the compounds produced by fermentation in foods. Vinegar, ripe fruit, kombucha, certain breads, all of these can produce olfactory similarities. Fred stared at him. So he might have actually smelled something. He might have smelled the kombucha you had 9 hours earlier, or residual fermentation odors from the church tablecloths, or nothing at all that was alcohol-related, and he was simply wrong, or he made it up. We don't know which of those is true. What matters legally is what can be proven. And what can be proven? That you have 3 breathalyzer readings of 0. That you tested negative for any blood alcohol content. That you voluntarily invoked your constitutional rights in an articulate and non-confrontational manner. That you have no history of drunk driving. That you are, by documentation and by testimony, 11 years sober. Marcus paused. And that officer Ronald Carol filed an arrest report citing strong odor of alcoholic beverage, without administering any field sobriety testing in a properly documented manner, and without conducting a breathalyzer at the scene. He didn't breathalyze me at the scene, Fred confirmed. No, Marcus said. He didn't. He wrote something in his pad. Fred caught a glimpse of the word. Pattern. Mr. Williams, Marcus said, I want you to understand something. I'm going to get you out of here tonight, and the DWI charge against you will be dismissed. That part is straightforward. The breathalyzer alone makes it straightforward. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time answering. Fred waited. How important is it to you that we stop at getting the charge dismissed? Or is it important to you that we find out whether this has happened before? The holding room hummed. The fluorescent light flickered once. Fred thought about 11 years and 3 months and 14 days. Tell me what you mean by before, he said. Marcus Webb opened his briefcase and pulled out a second legal pad. I mean, he said carefully, that a pattern is not the same thing as a mistake. Fred Williams was released at 2:31 a.m. on October 15th on a personal recognizance bond with a court date set for 45 days out. The DWI charge remained officially active. Dismissal would require either the DA's office to act or a judge to rule. But Marcus Webb had made it clear to Sergeant Dreyer in a brief, polite, and remarkably pointed conversation that the breathalyzer results made the charge untenable and that they would be pursuing every available avenue to establish that. Dreyer had listened. He had said very little, but he had the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. Camille was waiting outside with the car. Father and daughter drove home in the early morning dark without speaking much, because they were both people who processed things internally before they processed them aloud. Fred stared out the passenger window at Georgia going by, strip malls and pine trees, and the occasional lit-up fast food sign. He thought about his mother's journal on his nightstand. He thought about what he was going to write in it in the morning. Still standing, he thought, harder than usual, but still standing. Over the next 6 weeks, Marcus Webb did what Marcus Webb did. He worked. He filed a public records request for Officer Ronald Carroll's complete arrest history, including all DWI arrests in the previous 7 years. This was a standard move, legally unremarkable, but the results were not unremarkable at all. In 7 years, Ronald Carol had initiated 87 DWI investigations. Of those, 54 had resulted in arrests. Of the 54 arrests, 31 had proceeded to formal charges. Of those 31, 19 had resulted in convictions or plea agreements. Those numbers, on the surface, looked like a productive officer doing his job. But Marcus Webb was interested in a different set of numbers. Of Carroll's 54 DWI arrests, 38, approximately 70%, had involved black drivers. In a county where black residents made up approximately 34% of the population. Of the 16 DWI arrests where Carroll had documented odor of alcoholic beverage as the primary initiating observation, 14 involved black drivers. Of the cases that had been dismissed, either by the DA or by a judge, 11 of 13 involved black drivers, who had, at intake processing, produced breathalyzer readings at or near 0. Marcus sat with those numbers for a long time. Then he called his wife, Patricia Okafor. "How busy are you for the next few months?" he asked. "Incredibly," she said. "I need your help." She came over that evening, and they spread their notes across the kitchen table and ordered Thai food that went largely uneaten and talked until 2 in the morning. By the end of that conversation, they had agreed on something. This was not going to be just Fred Williams's case. This was going to be something larger if the people whose cases had been dismissed were willing to come forward. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus and Patricia tracked down 9 individuals who had been arrested by Officer Ronald Carol for DWI, had produced breathalyzer readings at or near 0, and whose charges had subsequently been dismissed or reduced. All 9 were black. 7 of the 9 agreed to speak to Marcus and Patricia on the record. Their stories were variations on the same story. driving while doing nothing wrong, lights in the rearview mirror, the approach, the lean in, the words, "I smell alcohol," the demand to perform tests, the arrest, the breathalyzer at the station reading 0, the quiet, confused dismissal of charges, often without explanation, sometimes without even an apology, as if the entire thing had been an administrative error rather than a man being put in handcuffs for a crime he had not committed and could not have committed. One of the 9 was a woman named Dolores Hutchins, 64 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had been arrested at 7:30 in the morning on her way to church 6 months earlier. She had not had a drink in 32 years, following a religious conversion she described with deep conviction. She had wept quietly in Marcus Webb's office while telling her story, not because she was fragile, but because she had never been given a space in which the telling of it was taken seriously. One was a young man named Terrell Moss, 22 years old, a college student who didn't drink because, he said simply, he just never liked the taste of it. He had been on his way home from a study group. He had spent the night in a holding cell and missed a major exam. The professor had been unsympathetic. The charge had been dismissed 3 weeks later with no fanfare. He had never received an explanation. One was a man named James Copeland, 47, who had breathalyzed at 0.003 times at intake, and who told Marcus that Officer Carol had said to him before the arrest, "You people think you can get away with anything." James Copeland had not reported this because, he told Marcus, "I was afraid it would make things worse. I was afraid of what he might do." Marcus Webb read that sentence back to himself 3 times before he moved on. He went to the DA's office. The Delmont County District Attorney was a woman named Helen Castillo, 56 years old, who had held the position for 8 years, and who had, in those 8 years, developed a reputation for being precise, unflappable, and occasionally fierce. She had prosecuted murders and embezzlers, and men in expensive suits who believed their money would protect them. She had also, in that same time, maintained a working relationship with the Delmont Police Department that had generally been functional and professional. She was not, Marcus Webb would later say, what he had feared she would be. He requested a meeting and was given one within 48 hours, which itself told him something about how seriously she was taking the preliminary information she'd received from her office. He laid everything out. Fred Williams's arrest, the breathalyzer results, the statistical analysis of Carol's arrest history, the 7 witness accounts, Sergeant Dreyer's notation about the 0 readings. He put documents on her desk with the care of someone who had organized them to be read in a specific order for a specific effect. Helen Castillo read everything. She asked 8 questions. She listened to every answer. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How long do you think this has been going on?" she asked. "The records I've been able to access go back 7 years, Marcus said. But I believe the pattern predates what I can document." "Why?" "Because the 9 people I found were the ones whose charges were dismissed. They are, by definition, the tip of the iceberg. The people whose cases weren't dismissed, who pled out, who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles, who didn't know they could fight it. Those people aren't in my numbers. They're in Carol's conviction statistics." Castillo looked at him with an expression that was, Marcus thought, the face of a person confronting something they had been half aware of for a long time, without ever quite looking at directly. "I need to review this with my team," she said. "Of course." "And I need to speak to Sergeant Dreyer." "Of course." She stood. Webb." "Yes. The Williams case will be dismissed before the week is out." "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said, with a kind of measured weariness. "That's not a favor. That's just what should have happened before he spent a night in my county's holding cell." The DWI charge against Fred Williams was formally dismissed on November 3rd. Marcus called Fred at 9:07 that morning. Fred was at work. He was standing in someone's garage fixing an HVAC unit that had been making a grinding noise for 3 months. He had grease on his hands and sweat on his collar, and when his phone buzzed and he saw Marcus Webb's name, he stood very still for a moment before he answered. "It's done," Marcus said. Fred leaned against the wall of the garage. He pressed his free hand against the cool concrete. Outside the garage door, October sunlight was doing what October sunlight does in Georgia. Warm and gold and generous, like something that doesn't know it's going to end. "Okay," he said. His voice was steady. "There's more," Marcus said, "but it's going to take time. Are you ready for more?" Fred thought about the journal on his nightstand. He thought about Dolores Hutchins weeping quietly across a desk. He thought about Tyrell Moss missing an exam. He thought about James Copeland saying he was afraid of what might happen. "Yeah," Fred Williams said. "I'm ready." Helen Castillo moved quietly. That was her way. She did not call press conferences. She did not leak to the papers. She opened a formal internal investigation into the DWI arrest practices of Officer Ronald Carol on November 8th, and she did it with the cooperation of the Delmont Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, or rather, more precisely, with the cooperation of Internal Affairs over the pointed objection of Carol's direct supervisor, a lieutenant named Gary Foss, who argued that the investigation was politically motivated and would be damaging to morale. Castillo told Foss, through a departmental liaison, that she appreciated his concern and that the investigation would proceed. The investigation had 3 tracks. The first track was the documentary review. Every arrest report Carol had filed in his 9 years on the force, every DWI citation, every incident report, cross-referenced against breathalyzer results from the processing center. This was the work of 2 deputy DA investigators named Chen and Ramirez, who spent 3 weeks in a small office surrounded by printed spreadsheets and highlighters and an extraordinary amount of coffee. The second track was the witness interviews. Marcus and Patricia had given Castillo's team the contact information for their 7 clients. Over 6 weeks, the investigative team interviewed all 7, plus an additional 14 individuals they identified through the documentary review. Of the 21 total, 17 agreed to make formal statements. The third track was the most delicate. It was the question of what Sergeant Dreyer knew and when, and what he had done about it. Dreyer was interviewed on November 19th. He was honest, after a fashion, the fashion of a man who had known something was wrong and had written notes to himself rather than acting on them. He told investigators that he had noticed Carol's arrest patterns over the years. He said he had raised concerns informally with Lieutenant Foss on 2 occasions. He produced documentation of those conversations that was, Marcus Webb thought when he later reviewed it, simultaneously exculpatory and damning. Exculpatory, because it showed Dreyer had tried to flag something, and damning, because it showed exactly how clearly Foss had chosen not to act. Foss was interviewed on December 2nd. His interview was, by all accounts, not a comfortable experience for anyone in the room. Lieutenant Gary Foss had 3 options when confronted with evidence that Carol had been flagged internally. He could claim ignorance, he could admit knowledge, and claim he'd done nothing wrong, or he could cooperate with the investigation in hopes of reducing his personal exposure. He tried, over the course of 4 hours, all 3 of these approaches in rotating sequence, which produced an interview record that one investigator later described privately as a master class in how not to answer questions. Ronald Carol was placed on administrative leave on December 9th. He did not take it quietly. His lawyer, a defense attorney named Vic Brower, who specialized in representing law enforcement, immediately issued a public statement calling the investigation a politically motivated attack on a decorated officer with an exemplary record, and noting that smelling the odor of alcohol is a legitimate observation that has been the basis for DWI investigations in every jurisdiction in America. The statement generated a segment on a local news affiliate and several hundred comments on the station's Facebook page, ranging from vigorous support for Carol to vigorous support for Fred Williams, with very little nuance in between. Fred watched the news clip from his living room couch, with Camille sitting beside him and the leather journal open on the coffee table. "How are you feeling about all this?" Camille asked. Fred considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Complicated," he said. "It's complicated. Are you scared?" "Not anymore." He looked at his hands, resting in his lap, hands that had held a steering wheel and handcuffs and a ballpoint pen, and now, the edge of something larger than himself. "I think I stopped being scared of this a while ago. I think the sobriety taught me that. You can't be scared of the truth once you've faced something harder than the truth." Camille put her head on his shoulder. Outside the window, Georgia was doing what Georgia does in December. Cold front coming in, the trees bare but dignified, the sky the particular pewter color that makes evenings feel like something important is about to be said. Ronald Carol had been wearing a body camera on the night of October 14th. This was not in itself remarkable. All Delmont PD officers were required to wear body cameras under a department-wide policy implemented in 2021. The cameras activated automatically when an officer exited a vehicle. What was remarkable, and what became one of the central elements of the investigation, was the body camera footage from Carol's stop of Fred Williams. Marcus Webb had filed a request for that footage as part of the original case. He had received it within the statutory deadline. He had watched it in his office with Patricia on a laptop screen, both of them very still, not talking, while the footage played. The footage showed Carol's approach to Fred's truck. It showed the exchange of license and registration. It showed Carol directing Fred out of the vehicle. It showed Fred stepping out calmly, hands visible, a posture non-threatening. And then it showed the moment where Carol leaned forward toward Fred's face. The audio on the body camera was clear, clearer than the video. "I smell alcohol on your breath," Carol said. And then, a fraction of a second later, picked up by the directional microphone, clear as anything, there was the sound of Carol taking a deliberate breath. Not a subtle inhalation. A performance. An inhale that was slightly too large, slightly too theatrical. The breath of someone doing something on camera that they intended to be seen on camera. Marcus had played that moment 6 times. Patricia had played it 4 more. Then they had called an expert. Dr. Anita Bose was an olfactory neurologist at Emory University whose research focused on, among other things, the mechanisms of human scent detection and identification. She was 58 years old, wore her hair in a tight silver bun, and had the manner of a person who found imprecision genuinely offensive. Dr. Bose reviewed the body camera footage and wrote a 3-page expert opinion that included the following observations. First, the human nose cannot reliably distinguish between the odor of ethanol and the odor of other fermentation byproducts, including those produced by kombucha, certain vinegars, and fermented foods, particularly in trace amounts and at the distances typical of a traffic stop interaction. Second, police officer training in odor of alcoholic beverage detection is largely subjective and has been documented in peer-reviewed literature as producing significant rates of false positives, particularly in cases involving fermented non-alcoholic beverages, mouthwashes containing alcohol-adjacent compounds, and certain medical conditions. Third, the manner of inhalation documented in the body camera footage was inconsistent with an involuntary olfactory response to a genuine detected odor. It was, in Dr. Bose's professional opinion, more consistent with a deliberate demonstration for recording purposes. That third point was the one that landed hardest in the DA's conference room when it was presented to Castillo's team in early January. A deliberate demonstration for recording purposes, Not a mistake. Not a misidentification. A performance. D.A. Castillo had looked at the expert report for a long time without speaking. Then she had looked at the body camera freeze frame that showed Carol's face in that fraction of a second after the inhalation. And on that face was an expression that, in context, was difficult to describe as anything other than settled. Resolved. The expression of a person who has already decided something and is now simply executing it. "I want to know," Castillo said to her team, "how many times that same expression is on that face and how many other recordings." Chen and Ramirez went back to work. The story broke publicly on January 17th. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the story did not break because of a press conference or a strategic leak. It broke because Tyrell Moss, 22 years old, and the college student who had missed his exam, had told his story to a friend who ran a moderately popular social media account focused on civil rights issues in the South, and that friend had posted a 3-paragraph summary with the words, "This man spent a night in a Georgia jail for drinking water and kombucha." By 6 p.m., the post had 60,000 shares. By 8 p.m., it had been picked up by 2 regional news affiliates. By midnight, it was national. Fred Williams's phone, which had been quietly on during all of this, began to ring at approximately 9:30 p.m. and did not stop ringing for the better part of 4 days. He did not answer most of the calls because Marcus Webb had advised him, firmly, professionally, with the focus of a man who knew exactly how these things could go sideways, to let the legal process work before putting his face and his words in front of every camera that was suddenly pointed at the story. But there was one call he answered. It came at 10:47 p.m. on January 17th from a number he didn't recognize, a 678 area code. "Mr. Williams?" said a woman's voice, careful and quiet. "Speaking." "My name is Dolores Hutchins. You don't know me, but I know who you are," Fred said. A pause on the line. "They arrested me too," Dolores said. "On my way to church. I didn't know what to do. I thought it was just me. I thought maybe I had done something wrong that I didn't understand." Fred closed his eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "You didn't do a single thing wrong." Dolores Hutchins began to cry, quietly, the way someone cries when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally been given permission to put it down. Fred sat with her on the phone for 40 minutes, while the rest of the country argued about his story on the internet. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark with his mother's journal on the nightstand, and he talked to Dolores Hutchins, and he listened to her, and he told her what he had learned in 11 years of fighting something harder than a crooked cop, that the truth, fully told and fully witnessed, has a weight to it, that eventually nothing can hold back. Ronald Carol's administrative hearing was scheduled for February 3rd. In the weeks between the public story breaking and the hearing, several things happened in rapid and consequential succession. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened its own inquiry into the pattern of arrests, acting on a referral from D.A. Castillo's office. This moved the investigation from the level of the county DA into the realm of state-level scrutiny, which meant that the Delmont PD's ability to manage the narrative through internal channels was substantially reduced. Lieutenant Gary Foss retired, abruptly and without public comment, on January 28th. His retirement paperwork was submitted 6 months ahead of his eligible date. He cited personal reasons. No one in the department publicly pushed back on this explanation. The city of Delmont retained outside legal counsel to review its potential civil liability exposure. Then 2 of Fred Williams's fellow arrestees, Tyrell Moss and a man named Antoine Briggs, had separately retained attorneys. The city's outside counsel, in a preliminary memo that was not supposed to become public, but inevitably did, used the phrase significant liability risk 3 times in 4 pages. The body camera footage, the specific moment of the inhale, the specific expression on Carol's face, was broadcast nationally on 2 major cable news programs. An anchor at one network called it chilling. A commentator at another called it exactly what we've been saying for years. Neither of these characterizations was wrong, exactly, but neither of them captured the specific texture of what it actually was, which was quieter and more specific, and, in its own way, more disturbing than the outrage could contain. On February 3rd, Sir Ronald Carol appeared at his administrative hearing at Delmont Police Department headquarters. His attorney Vic Brower was with him. He was dressed in his uniform, pressed and careful. He had the look of a man who had decided, after the chaos of the previous weeks, to present himself as simply and plainly as possible. The hearing panel consisted of 3 people: a retired judge named Dorothea Wills, a civilian oversight board member named Raymond Park, and an assistant DA from Castillo's office named Jessica Herrera. Dorothea Wills ran the hearing with the focused precision of someone who had been doing this for decades and did not intend to waste anyone's time. Carol was given the opportunity to present his account of the October 14th stop. He did so carefully, sticking close to the language of his arrest report. He acknowledged the breathalyzer results. He maintained that his olfactory observation had been genuine and that the subsequent 0 readings did not invalidate that observation, merely indicated that whatever he had smelled was not ethanol from recent consumption. This was, to be fair, not an entirely impossible position. Jessica Herrera then presented the statistical analysis. The numbers were read aloud, slowly, into the record. The panel had copies in front of them. 38 of 54 DWI arrests involving black drivers, in a county where black residents were 34% of the population. 14 of 16 odor observations involving black drivers. 11 of 13 dismissed cases involving black drivers with near 0 breathalyzer readings. Raymond Park, the civilian oversight board member, asked Carol directly, "Can you explain why the racial distribution of your DWI arrests is so significantly skewed relative to the population distribution?" Carol's attorney objected that the question assumed a correlation that had not been established as causal. Dorothea Wills said, "The officer may answer." Carol said that he patrolled certain areas of the city more frequently, and those areas happened to have higher proportions of black residents. Park said, "Which areas?" Carol named 2 neighborhoods. Park produced a map. "Neither of those neighborhoods is on Calder Street, where you stopped Mr. Williams." Carol said that was a fair point, and that he occasionally patrolled outside his primary areas. Park said, "How often?" There was a pause. Vic Brower said, "No, the officer doesn't have that data available." "I'd like that data," Park said, addressing the record. The hearing continued for 6 hours. Dr. Anita Bose testified via video from her office at Emory. She walked the panel through her analysis of the body camera footage with the same precise, slightly impatient clarity she had brought to her written report. When Brower attempted to cross-examine her on the subjective nature of olfactory experience in law enforcement, she said, without heat, but with absolute firmness, "The subjective nature of olfactory detection is precisely what I study, counselor. I'm happy to discuss the peer-reviewed literature at whatever length you'd like." Brower declined. 2 of the 17 individuals who had given statements to the DA's team testified in person. One of them was Dolores Hutchins. She sat at the witness table in a navy blue dress and read her statement in a voice that was steady throughout. And she looked at the panel the entire time. And when she was done, she looked briefly at Ronald Carol, directly, fully, without flinching. And then she looked away. Whatever Ronald Carol felt in that moment, he kept it entirely internal. Fred Williams did not testify at the administrative hearing. Marcus Webb had made a strategic decision that Fred's appearance should be reserved, if needed, for later proceedings. Fred had accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had learned to trust the advice of people who knew more than he did about the specific game being played. He sat in the public gallery instead, in a suit, with Camille on one side and Marcus on the other, and he watched. The panel delivered its findings on February 14th, Valentine's Day, a coincidence that various commentators would note with varying degrees of irony. The administrative panel's finding, delivered in a 22-page document that was immediately made public, was as follows. Officer Ronald Carol had engaged in a pattern of racially discriminatory policing practices in his administration of DWI investigations, in violation of the Delmont Police Department's policies, the Georgia Law Enforcement Use of Force Standards, and the equal protection provisions of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The panel found that the statistical evidence, the witness testimonies, the expert analysis of the body camera footage, and the documented internal complaints that had been improperly dismissed by Lieutenant Foss collectively constituted clear and convincing evidence of a systematic pattern rather than isolated incidents. The recommended sanction was termination. The panel also made a secondary finding, which was, in some ways, more significant than the primary one. It found that the departmental culture at Delmont PD had enabled, through inaction and willful ignorance at the supervisory level, the continuation of practices that should have been identified and corrected years earlier. It recommended a full departmental review, external civilian oversight expansion, and mandatory retraining. It recommended that the city conduct an outreach process to identify individuals who might have been wrongfully arrested under similar circumstances in the prior 7 years and review their cases. 7 years. The same time frame Marcus Webb had used for his analysis. Ronald Carol was terminated on February 19th. Vic Brower announced that Carol would appeal. In a statement released through Brower's office, Carol maintained that he had acted in good faith at all times, that his arrest of Fred Williams had been based on genuine observation, and that the panel's findings were the result of a politically charged climate rather than an honest evaluation of his conduct. The statement generated fewer comments than the original social media post about Fred Williams. That afternoon, Fred Williams was in his office, a modest, functional space above the HVAC repair shop, walls covered in the kind of practical organizational charts and permit paperwork that are the unglamorous backbone of a small business, when Marcus Webb called to tell him about the termination. He listened to the summary. He asked 2 questions. He said thank you. Then he sat for a while with the phone on his desk and the sounds of his shop below him, the clatter of tools, the voices of his employees, the ordinary music of a working day. And he thought about what it meant to have fought something all the way to the end and to still be standing at the other end of it. It didn't feel the way he had expected it to feel when he'd imagined this moment. It didn't feel like victory, exactly. It felt more like relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been told he can put it down. He opened his bottom drawer and took out the leather journal. He wrote the date. And then he wrote, for the first time in 11 years, something other than still standing. He wrote, standing for something. The civil litigation took another 14 months. Marcus Webb and Patricia Okafor filed suit on behalf of Fred Williams and 7 of the co-plaintiffs against the city of Delmont, Officer Ronald Carol in his personal capacity, and Lieutenant Gary Foss in his personal capacity. The suits were consolidated. The city's outside counsel, as expected, pursued every available procedural avenue to delay and limit the proceedings. This worked for a while, and then it didn't. The deposition of Lieutenant Gary Foss, which took place in April of the following year, became a document that would be discussed in Georgia law enforcement circles for a long time. Foss had retained his own attorney, separate from the city's, which itself spoke volumes about how he assessed his personal exposure. under oath and under questioning from Patricia Okafor, who was widely described by observers as terrifyingly prepared. Foss admitted that he had received verbal complaints about Carol's arrest patterns from Sergeant Dreyer, that he had not forwarded those complaints to internal affairs, and that he had made a conscious decision not to open a formal inquiry because, in his words, Carol's numbers were good, and I didn't want to create a situation. Patricia had then asked Foss what he meant by Carol's numbers. His arrest rate, Foss said, his conviction rate, the DWI numbers. And what does that have to do with not wanting to create a situation? Officers with strong numbers. It affects the department's performance metrics. The department's performance metrics affect funding. Patricia had looked at Gary Foss for a moment. So, the reason you chose not to investigate credible complaints of discriminatory policing, she said slowly, was that the officer producing those arrests was improving the department's statistical metrics, which were tied to the department's funding? Foss had looked at his attorney. His attorney had said carefully, "Why, you can answer." "That was a factor in my thinking," Foss said. "Yes." That sentence, those 9 words, became the headline. It ran on 4 national news programs. It was quoted in a New York Times article about the systemic incentives of police performance metrics. It was cited in a brief filed by 2 civil rights organizations that were monitoring the case. D.A. Helen Castillo, who read the deposition transcript on a Friday evening after everyone else had left her office, sat with it for a long time. She had spent 8 years doing a job that required her to hold 2 things simultaneously: the genuine belief that most law enforcement worked honestly and hard, and the equally genuine understanding that systems, without accountability, tend to protect themselves rather than the people they're supposed to serve. This was not a new tension, but Foss's 9 words made it exceptionally concrete. She started a new file. The case was settled in June of that year. The terms were not publicly disclosed in their entirety, though Marcus Webb confirmed in a public statement that the settlement was substantial and that it included, beyond the financial component, enforceable departmental reform requirements with independent monitoring and annual public reporting. Fred Williams gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. 2 sentences, delivered in the same measured, clear voice he'd used on Calder Street when he'd told a police officer he was exercising his rights. "I didn't do this for the settlement," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And because there are people who went through the same thing I went through and never got to stand in front of a camera and say so. This one's for them." Tyrell Moss, standing nearby, said nothing. But he was there. Dolores Hutchins was there too, in the navy blue dress. James Copeland, who had been told, "You people think you can get away with anything," was in the back of the assembled group, quieter than anyone, with an expression that was too complex to name. Ronald Carol's appeal of his termination was denied 8 months later by the Georgia Employment Review Board. He was, as of the last available public record, working in private security in a county 2 hours north of Delmont. Sergeant Dreyer retired the same month as the settlement. He left a note on Castillo's desk, not emailed, not formal, on just a handwritten note. That said, "I should have pushed harder. I know that. I'm sorry." Castillo kept the note. In the months after the settlement, Fred Williams spoke to several groups: churches, community organizations, a criminal justice reform conference in Atlanta, a panel at the law school where Patricia Okafor had gone to school. He was not a public speaker by nature or ambition. He was a man who ran a heating and air conditioning business and coached youth basketball on Saturday mornings, and had a daughter he was enormously proud of. But he had a story that people needed to hear, and he was, by temperament and by recovery, a person who understood the responsibility of telling the truth when you happen to have possession of a piece of it. These are the things he said, in various forms, in various rooms, not across all those conversations. He said, The worst thing about that night was not the handcuffs. The worst thing was the moment before the handcuffs, when I thought, just for a second, that I must have done something wrong without knowing it. That's what years of being told you're the problem does to a person. It makes you doubt the clearest thing in the world, your own innocence. He said, I was prepared. Not fully, not perfectly, but more prepared than most people get to be. I knew I had the right to ask if I was being detained. I knew field sobriety tests were voluntary. I knew to be calm and be clear and be specific. None of that stopped me from being arrested, but it gave me something to build on when the truth had to come out. The rights matter. Knowing the rights matters. And it matters more than most people realize until they're standing on the side of the road at 9:47 at night with lights in their eyes. He said, I don't hate Ronald Carol. I know that's something people want me to say, but I don't have it in me to hate him. What I have is something harder than hate, which is clarity. I see clearly what he did and what it cost and how many people it cost, and I am going to spend part of my life making sure it costs less going forward. That's not forgiveness. It's not the same as forgiveness. It's just deciding that the anger serves you better as fuel than as fire. He said, my mother always told me that the truth has a weight to it. It goes down into the ground, and it sits there, and it waits. And things built on top of it that aren't true eventually start to sink. She said it in the context of my drinking, when I couldn't see my way out. But I've come to understand that it applies to more than that. It applies to everything. The truth sat in those breathalyzer readings. The truth sat in Sergeant Dreyer's notes. The truth sat in Dolores Hutchins's heart for 6 months before she had anywhere to take it. The truth waited, and eventually the things built on top of it started to sink. He said, know your rights, not as an act of defiance, as an act of dignity. There's a difference, and the difference matters. 11 years ago, Fred Williams sat in a rehabilitation program, and his mother pressed a leather journal into his hands. She told him, write the date every morning, just the date. It'll remind you that you're still here. He has written in that journal every morning since. He is still writing in it. The date he was arrested is in there. The date the charges were dismissed is in there. The date the settlement was signed is in there. Hundreds and hundreds of mornings, each one a single day chosen over the alternative. On the morning after the settlement, Fred wrote the date, and then he wrote something he'd been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't found the right words for until that morning, sitting on the edge of his bed in the early Georgia light, with the house quiet around him. He wrote, the road doesn't know who you are. The night doesn't know who you are. Sometimes the law doesn't know who you are. But you know. You know. And you hold on to it. And you tell the truth about it clearly and calmly and without shame. And eventually, the world has to adjust to the fact of you. And then he closed the journal and put it on the nightstand, and got up and made coffee, and called Camille and went to work, still standing for something.